Good evening, everyone. I'm Andrea Solomon, and on behalf of the entire Alumni Relations and Development team, it's my privilege to welcome you to another webinar in the Choate ConnectsUs series. We created this series to keep the greater Choate Rosemary Hall community connected during this time of social distancing. Coming up next in the series is a discussion with Terry O'Neill from the class of 1970 and Kira Jenny, Choate faculty member and newly named head of the History, Philosophy, Religion, and Social Sciences Department. They will talk about some of the ways today's political climate is impacting women in the United States and address the need for feminists, leaders, and legislators to be intersectional in their approach to crafting public policy, as well as some of the ways in which COVID-19 pandemic is having a disproportional impact on already marginalized communities. Keep an eye out for the invite coming soon. This evening, we are going to have a conversation about current challenges in social justice. This conversation will be moderated by Jonas Akins, a faculty member in the History, Philosophy, Religion, and Social Sciences Department. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you very much for joining us this evening. Thank you for the introduction, Andrea. I'm coming to you live from the second floor of Spencer House. I believe Monte's in Connecticut and Kristen's down in Washington, D.C. Joining us this evening are Monte Frank, class of '86, co-chair of Pullman and Comley's litigation practice. He ran for Lieutenant Governor of Connecticut in 2018, is a past president of the Connecticut Bar Association, and currently serves as co-chair of the Bar Association's COVID-19 task force. Also with us this evening is Kristen Clarke, class of 1993, president and executive director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. Recipient of the 2017 Alumni Award here at Choate, I had the pleasure of moderating a panel on public service for her 25th reunion back in 2018. As I mentioned at the start, I'm here on the second floor of Spencer House, where I've been running my classes ever since we got back from spring break, and we've all been adjusting to a new reality of social distancing and Zoom calls and webinars and a wide variety of other communication methods. I'm interested, Monte and Kristen, in how this new variety of communication methods has changed your day-to-day existence. With courts being closed, the Supreme Court heard oral arguments over the telephone, and a wide variety of other regular practices being disrupted. Monte, I don't know if you could start us with maybe how your practice as a lawyer has changed.
Sure, thanks, Jonas, and it's a real honor to be here with Kristen, who I've not met before. I read her bio, and I'm incredibly impressed and humbled to be with you tonight and to talk to some of my classmates from Choate and Choate alumni and parents. You know, what's interesting is that, you know, if you look at the overall crisis, there's not a segment of our society that has not been impacted. Some more than others. You know, people say that the virus doesn't discriminate. And you know that may be so from a scientific perspective, but it certainly has impacted disproportionately the Black and Brown community, Hispanic community, Native American community, the poor, the homeless, the near homeless, and created, you know, a system where you have really privileged people who are able to shoulder the, who are able to, you know, social distance and control their own destiny, and others who can't. And that's true to a certain extent of the court system as well. You know, we've seen that the Supreme Court is functioning by holding telephone arguments. But when you look at what's going on in the court systems in Connecticut and across the country, particularly the state courts, you know, they've essentially shut down. Which has a tremendous impact not only on, you know, my clients, business clients, and municipalities, but more so on impacting on the lives of Americans who rely on the court system, who need it for access to justice, who are looking to the court system to deal with issues like child custody and domestic violence. And so the courts have really been struggling as we've moved through this period of time of, you know, how do they protect court personnel like all of our employers do, like Choate did, like businesses do. At the same time, keep the doors open to allow those who really need it to be able to come to court. It's been a really difficult time for the court system, and I've been fortunate enough to be able to work with some of the chief court administrators. I'm talking on a daily basis with the Connecticut chief court administrator about it. How do we strike that balance to allow access to justice, to allow those who really need to get into the court system to do so and be heard and get justice, and at the same time protect court employees, court marshals, the public, and so forth. It's a real challenge. The courts have started to move in the direction that they need to be in, but there's a long way to go, and it's going to be a long haul before we get to the point where we have a fully functioning court system. I'm sure Kristen's seen the same on her side from dealing with civil rights issues.
Yeah, and Kristen, to that point, I'm curious if you could share with us maybe how the work of the Lawyers Committee has been impacted, and then any issues that have arisen specifically because of the restrictions on access to the court system that Monte mentioned.
Yeah, well, first, let me just say I'm so humbled to be here, and I'm so glad we're having this discussion, and a privilege to be with you as well, Monte, and you as well, Jonas. The pandemic, I think, has upended the world for everybody. I think our lives have been turned upside down. There is no playbook to guide us for this moment. And so in many respects, we're taking this day by day and trying to figure out how we soldier forward. For us at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, our work has only become more complex amid the pandemic. Our work was pretty challenging and grueling beforehand, but because of the racial disparities that we see in the wake of the pandemic, we're confronted with issues that we just can't ignore. We can't turn a blind eye to them. Whether you're talking about kids who are on the other side of the digital divide and not able to get equitable access to classrooms right now with distance learning, whether you're talking about people who are on the brink of homelessness because they don't know where their next paycheck or rent check's going to come from, whether you're talking about a criminal justice system where you have people confined in overcrowded jails where they are at high risk for contracting the virus, and jail populations are disproportionately Black and brown, or voting rights and how we ensure access to the ballot. In virtually every aspect of our work across the board, COVID has presented new questions, new challenges, and we are working remotely. We have had people impacted by COVID on our staff, on our board, and so we've been working remotely for several weeks now. But I deal with folks who feel that they're on the edge, on the brink of burnout. Mothers who are trying to figure out how they get their 5- and 6-year-olds set up on Zoom classes. I've got a 15-year-old, so he's managed to navigate that a little bit. But particularly for parents with young kids, I know that this is a really challenging time. Monte talked about the impact on the courts. In many cases, we've had some court delays, but in some instances, there's great urgency to the issues that we're fighting for. We had a lawyer in court today in Alexandria, Virginia. He went in with his American flag mask covering his face. There are distancing requirements that are in place, a limited number of people who have access to the courtroom. But yeah, there is just no playbook for this moment whatsoever. And it's also a moment that I think presents opportunities for new leadership to emerge. And so that's heartening. People who are finding the space to not be too overwhelmed by the moment and finding ways to show up and show new leadership. I think that's one thing that the pandemic presents an opportunity for.
To the question of restrictions and regulations, one of the things that's been interesting about having students spread across the country and frankly the world on these Zoom calls is when I ask them what it's like where they are, they give wildly disparate answers about the restrictions that are in place and the regulations that they're facing. And some of them view that as a real strength of an American system that has states able to make decisions independent of the federal government, and in some states, municipalities independent of the state. And others view it as a real problem, that there should be a more centralized approach to dealing with the restrictions in place. I was wondering if either of you have any thoughts on where we might come down, particularly to your point, Kristen, to improve on the leadership that we're looking for.
Well, I think this kind of gets into a debate about federalism and what do we think the role is for the federal government at this moment. And I very humbly believe that we need more leadership from our federal leaders in Washington, D.C. right now. We need guidance to help school districts and housing providers and employers kind of figure out how they navigate this new landscape. When you take a step back and kind of look at what's happening across the country, it's a bit chaotic. People are just trying to figure it out. It's very haphazard, patchwork of approaches. So this absolutely is a moment where I wish we saw the experts inside of our federal agencies really stepping up and providing more guidance to help people navigate this new normal that we're in.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. Following the Sandy Hook shooting, I represented the town of Newtown, and I lived in Sandy Hook, and I got very involved in gun violence prevention. I serve on the American Bar Association Standing Committee on Gun Violence, and I've worked pretty hard in the House of Delegates to pass resolutions that would have a direct impact on reducing gun violence. What we saw in that scenario has played out in a lot of respects what we're seeing with the federal reaction to the pandemic, and that you have certain states that have been proactive in trying to deal with gun violence. But as Kristen said, it's a patchwork, and what happens in Vermont or South Carolina or North Carolina has a direct impact on what's going on in Connecticut. If you look at Chicago, which has a significant gun violence problem, the majority of their crime guns are coming from Indiana and Wisconsin. They're not coming from within Illinois itself. Some are coming from the perimeter, but it's that lack of concerted federal leadership that has kept the gun violence issue front and center and hasn't reduced any of the numbers. And if you look at the pandemic, Connecticut, Washington, D.C. Have certainly been hotspots. New York has been a hotspot. But what we're realizing is that all of the states are connected. We are now connected globally. And unless we have a sense of concerted sacrifice and willingness to come together as a country to deal with the issue as one, we're going to continue to have hotspots. We take a step forward and then we take a step back. And that's disheartening. There needs to be real leadership from the White House, from Congress, and it's just not there. As a result, we are really suffering from it.
And you both mentioned elected leadership, which brings up the question of the 2020 elections. And we've seen a wide variety of responses during the primary season to what ought to be done. We've had a president who has himself voted absentee in the past, railing against absentee voting. And then I believe it was this morning, Twitter put a fact check for the first time ever on one of the president's claims about absentee voting. What are the things that you're most concerned about, either at the state level as you deal with the Monte, or nationally, Kristen, as you think about access to the polls as we move into 2020? And November is coming, whether or not we think March went on forever or not.
So these are questions that keep me up at night these days. The pandemic really has complicated the way in which voters can access the ballot this season. And take a step back, pre-pandemic, we've been contending with high levels of voter suppression all across the country. A Justice Department that hasn't filed a single voting rights case to enforce the Voting Rights Act on behalf of voters of color. A Supreme Court decision in 2013 that really opened up the floodgates to voter suppression efforts across the country. Government issued photo ID requirements, unnecessary burdens on people seeking to register to vote and more. So now pile on to that the barriers that we face in the wake of the pandemic, and it's a challenging picture. The good news is that there is bipartisan and resounding support among the public for vote by mail, which is something we absolutely need this season. People should not have to choose between their health and exercising the right to vote. And at the Lawyers Committee, we are pushing for as many avenues as possible for people to be able to vote. You can vote by mail if that's what you choose. You can vote during early voting if that's what you need. You can vote on election day if that's important to you, because the experience of voting in person just is something that matters to you. There are a number of states like California and New York that are kind of rising to the occasion and taking steps to ease access to absentee ballot applications, or California, which is just sending the absentee ballots to registered voters outright, which I think makes a lot of sense. But on the flip side, you have a lot of people who, for reasons that are just really hard to understand, unnecessarily fighting vote by mail. You've got Tennessee and Texas, for example, where state election officials are saying fear of COVID is not a legitimate basis to vote by absentee ballot. So we are fighting tooth and nail right now. We just filed a suit today in Kentucky to ensure access in the November general election to absentee ballots. And Kentucky actually, in the wake of the pandemic, adopted a government-issued ID requirement for voters. And DMV offices are closed around the state. We just sued Tennessee. This is a state that's not offering up absentee ballots to people who fear voting because of the pandemic. And on top of that, it's actually criminal in Tennessee to distribute absentee applications. So, again, a patchwork of laws in various states, but some degree of rising hostility to vote by mail. And it's just most unfortunate. I've spent my entire career fighting to ensure that eligible Americans have access to the ballot box. And the work, frankly, in the last few years has never been more challenging. You just have bad actors and hostile officials who are just bent on putting up barriers to the vote. And, it's a right that I believe we all got to fight for. Doesn't matter what your issue is. If education's your issue, criminal justice, police brutality, fair housing, it all comes down to the end of the day, who represents you. And at the ballot box on election day is where every American gets to have voice in that process. So work that keeps me up, Jonas.
I want to go back to something that, if I could, that Kristen said when she started talking about voting, which is that there were significant issues with voting rights and the way we conduct elections well before the pandemic hit. What the pandemic has done, it's brought to the surface tremendous inequality in America. And also, I think it highlights the dysfunction in our current political system, that we've become so polarized along this left-right axis with no ability to look for common solutions, to look to the science, to reach consensus, to lead at a federal level. And people, within a very short period of time, started viewing the pandemic and the state of emergency through their own political lens and bias. And that was fed by the media, and it was fed by the political parties, and certainly was fed by President Trump in ways that I think are disingenuous and causes further dissension among people rather than look for solutions. And that has been a problem that has been occurring through the election cycle for a long period of time and has only become more pronounced in the last couple of years. And as a result of that, we are no longer electing the best and the brightest. The best and the brightest are not willing to get into politics. When I got into, when I was asked to run for lieutenant governor on a nonpartisan ticket, former Democrat, former candidate for governor on the Republican side, trying to bring unity. And it was a great concept. We were endorsed by the Hartford Current. We were making tremendous strides. But we couldn't make any headway when it came down to election day, particularly when the parties threw everything at us and our numbers plummeted because of the fear that the other guy would get elected. If you voted, it even got to the point where one of our senators tweeted, a vote for Oz and Monte will be a vote for Donald Trump, which was ludicrous. But that's where our political process has come. So coming into the pandemic, I was already working with a group called SAM, the Serve America Movement, nationally on electoral reforms. There are things that are going on now that make our elections better and produce better leaders. If you look at California, they have top 2 public primaries. Why can't we have public top 4 or top 5 primaries open to all voters regardless of parties? Things like ranked choice voting. The state of Maine was very unhappy with the governor. They put in ranked choice voting for their federal election, and they are getting better candidates and people who are not really on the fringes, but are working together to try to find consensus. Talk about gerrymandering. That is an issue that is not as much of a problem in Connecticut, but in other parts. Why can't we have legislation to end partisan gerrymandering by creating an independent, fully transparent redistricting commission? So when you get to the pandemic and you start looking out at the 2020 presidential election, which is coming, voting by mail seems like a no-brainer, unless you don't want to have a lot of people turn out to vote. And so people are looking at it not in terms of what's best for the country, but what is in their own interest as a candidate or political party. And that's not serving the people. That's not serving us very well.
And Jonas, if I could just jump in with one point, because I know that there may be some students watching, some parents watching, but one thing that I think gets left out of the discussion about voting barriers in the wake of the pandemic is how the pandemic has had a chilling effect on voter registration efforts. You've got churches that are, closed, campuses shut down, grassroots organizers who can't knock on doors, and a lot of the organic, natural ways that we ordinarily reach people who are not yet registered, it's all kind of come to a grinding halt. And I'm worried about that. There are about 40 states where you can, to some degree, register to vote online. You've got a lot of students who may have registered for the very first time who are now relocated, somewhere else and kind of riding this period out, who may need absentee ballots in order to vote this primary or general election season. But the reality is that a presidential election year is the moment in our democracy where we capture the greatest numbers of people who are not yet registered. And here we are in a presidential election year, and a lot of that activity has really come to a halt. So I just wanted to put a pin in this issue. There may be parents out there watching who have kids, students who are displaced from their campuses. And I think there's a lot of collective work that we can do to make sure that everybody in our network is getting registered and positioned to have voice in the primaries that are still up and in the general elections that are happening this November. One thing that we run at the Lawyers Committee is a nonpartisan program called Election Protection, and it's anchored by a hotline, 866-OUR-VOTE, and it's a number that anyone in the country can call to get help with these questions. How do I register? How do I get an absentee ballot? When's the election happening in my state? Just kind of wanted to put something out there that folks should be particularly mindful of, and something that we can all collectively do about it.
And it's interesting that we have as many concerns about voting access in the same year that we have a census ongoing. And I know that there are real concerns about how, to Monte's point about gerrymandering, and to your point, Kristen, about how students may have been displaced. I know that here we were supposed to take the census with all of the students in residence, and Wallingford would have had a slight boost to its population. But those seemingly mundane decisions and those processes that have been impacted by this will have long-lasting implications that I think we're just beginning to understand. Is there anything that we can do now for November? Is there anything that we should be working on at our local level, at our state level, or the federal level as private citizens that can help to ensure the integrity of the coming elections?
I think we absolutely can. Certainly, there ought to be a lot of pressure put on our elected officials to adopt voting by mail. Having said that, there is a little bit of validity of the possibility of voter fraud with absentee ballots. In Connecticut, if you follow local politics, following the mayoral election in Bridgeport, there was a lawsuit that was brought by the woman who did not win, and she lost the election purely based on absentee ballots. And there was evidence that was presented to the court of abuses with the absentee ballot system, but it didn't rise to the level that was necessary to overturn an election. So, I'm not saying that the negatives outweigh the positives at all. We need to have a strong vote by mail system and absentee ballots, but there do need to be protections put into place to eliminate any chance of fraud. I think the whole fraud issue is a red herring, but also should not be ignored. There ought to be protections that put into place. But that's critical. I mean, if we're going to have a real election in 2020, we can't repeat what happened in Wisconsin recently, where people have to go to the ballot box to actually cast their vote. I mean, that would have a dramatic effect on reducing votes, which to me would be a real harm to our democracy.
And I actually have a graduate school classmate who was running for Congress in North Carolina, and you may have seen North Carolina 9. There was fraud committed by his opponent to illegally harvest what appeared to be valid ballots, and then change the vote on them. And it was a particularly sophisticated form of voter suppression, which I think speaks to the need for a robust system for these sorts of voting. Kristen, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, that ballot harvesting scheme in North Carolina was outrageous, and I think it marked the first time in modern history that we had to have a do-over election for a congressional seat. But I think that at the end of the day, these instances of fraud are infinitesimal and don't justify the burden that officials ultimately resort to. They kind of use these isolated examples of fraud to push and drive forward voter suppression efforts that can lock out hundreds of thousands of eligible voters. You've got, at the end of the day, a greater chance of being struck by lightning than seeing vote fraud carried out in our elections. And these examples that we're talking about are beyond few and far between. At the end of the day, people struggle to access the ballot box and have hurdle after hurdle after hurdle that they've got to jump through. But to your question about what folks can do now, I think there's a role for everybody. At the congressional level right now, there is a big push for Congress to allocate the funding that states need to really implement reforms that can provide access for voters this season. That means adequate funding for the U.S. Postal Service, which is on the brink of collapse. That means real funding for states to put in place things like, aggressive vote by mail. At the state level, laws vary state by state, but depending on where you are, if you're not in a state that's providing access to vote by mail, if you're in Tennessee, if you're in Texas, if you're in Ohio, there are a whole series of states, Georgia, where officials are putting up on just unnecessary hoops and hurdles. This is a moment to have voice, to pick up the phone, to use social media, to bring pressure to bear on officials. They respond to that pressure. And but just to kind of humanize this question a little bit, I think we also have to remember that there is an unprecedented pandemic gripping the nation, and there are people who are suffering. There are people who have lost loved ones. There are people who know people who've been hospitalized. There are people who lost their jobs. There are people who, may be on the brink of homelessness. And I think sometimes within these moments of chaos, it's kind of hard to prioritize the right to vote in those contexts. So I think this is a moment to really show empathy for people out there who are suffering. And I think it's a moment where we just need to be reminded of that. It's going to take a little bit of work, I think, for people to understand why this election season is so urgent and critical. I remember contending with issues down in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. You had people displaced to Texas and Arkansas, and it was remarkable. People wanted that right to vote in their local and state elections. I watched people come back to the city by the busload. They drove for hours by the bus load to exercise their right to vote, to speak to who was going to be at that city council seat, who was going to be in that state legislative seat, fighting for them to figure out their road home. And this is kind of that moment where, for people who are suffering, I think there is a narrative that we need to be talking to the public about why this election season in particular matters so much. The people who are, sitting in that school board, city council, state legislative seat, Congress, White House, are going to have critical work ahead of them. We're going to have to do a lot of work that will take years, I think, to really kind of rebuild the country and get us back to the status quo. So, just making sure people know how to get that absentee ballot, making sure people know how to get registered, making sure people know when their primary and general election is, but also just talking about why the right to vote matters so much, I think is an assignment that we can all take from this session.
Sure.
And I think when you look at the right to vote and our current system of voting, I am hoping that the pandemic, among all sorts of other things, serves as a tipping point for all of us to take a look at our democracy, whether it's working and whether there are changes that are necessary in our electoral process. For a bunch of examples, right? We have a primary system in Connecticut where 41% of the voters who are unaffiliated are not able to vote. And so, how does that serve our democracy when the public is actually paying for those primaries? Again, some of the things I talked about before, things that are going on in California, Washington State, ranked choice voting. I think we need to really look at those things and figure out whether we can produce better leaders who are focused on consensus building, and where compromise is actually a good thing in order to do all the things that are necessary so that when the next pandemic hits or the next hurricane, we are not faced with such disparate results among people. It's not fair that the Black and the brown community and Hispanic community had to have shouldered such a heavy burden in this pandemic. And I think it really highlights our failure, our democratic system over the last 5 years or so, not more.
And we've seen remarkably disparate impacts on communities of color in terms of health outcomes, especially at the moment. But I'm curious to know, what long-lasting impacts of the pandemic are you most worried about? Is it the health impacts? Is it the income impacts? Is it something like the closure of public schools and the education associated with that, and the free and reduced price lunches that might go along? Where are we going to see the longest lasting impacts of this pandemic in terms of inequality? And hopefully, once we've identified that, maybe what we can do about it?
That's a hard question, frankly, because I think every issue that you laid out is just so critically important. The pandemic has kind of ripped a Band-Aid off and exposing a lot of the deep socioeconomic inequality, the racial inequality that has long beleaguered our nation. It is just exposed for everyone to see. African Americans are not more predisposed genetically to COVID. The reason we're seeing higher infection rates are because of lack of access to health care. It's because Black and brown people are in a higher number of frontline essential workers where they are exposed to greater risk. It is because they encounter greater levels of provider bias, because they are turned away at higher levels from care and treatment when they go to hospitals, because of pre-existing conditions. I mean, we have a lot of work to do, I think, to figure out how we get to the root of all this. It's not sustainable, and this won't be the last pandemic to grip the nation. The joblessness rates that we see are continuing to spike and will disrupt families for years to come. And the recession already exacerbated a lot of the racial inequality that we see in the country, and no doubt the pandemic will just widen those gaps. In the 60s, we had the Kerner Commission, where the federal government did some work to kind of figure out how, on the heels of riots in the 60s, we could really undertake some real work to rebuild the nation and to close existing racial gaps. And I kind of think that we are at that moment once again, where we're going to need strong leadership to help map out a path for the future. We're going to need strong leadership that can help heal a nation that is divided. We're going to need to do just a lot of work to figure out how we close gaps that have only widened in the wake of the pandemic. So I can't answer that question by pointing to one issue, because I just think all of those issues kind of speak to the health of the nation. And right now we're a nation in bad shape.
Yeah, Jonas, when I was at Choate, I remember Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan came to speak about all the work he was doing in New York about social justice. And I remember a young representative from Massachusetts, Barney Frank, came and spoke, and he talked about, the saying that the high tide lifts all boats. And I vividly remember saying, well, what about the guy who's fallen out of the boat and can't swim? What is the high tide doing for him? And I remember that vividly, and it had that talk had a lasting impact on me. And then when I got involved in gun violence prevention work, I spent time in Baltimore and Harlem, and Detroit and Chicago, and then ran for lieutenant governor. And for the students out there, if you ever have the opportunity to run for a statewide office, do it. It's a privilege that, win or lose, you'll never forget, and you'll learn more than you will ever learn any other capacity. People open up to you, whether it's at the C-suite of the biggest companies in the country or in a living room in a broken down house in the Frog Hollow section of Hartford, in ways that you can not imagine. They want to tell you their story. And what I saw in Bridgeport and Hartford and neighborhoods in New Haven made me realize that, our country is failing a lot of people. And what the pandemic has done is really magnified all of those issues. I mean, for a lot of these people, it really is the perfect storm, because it highlights the critical legal issues surrounding criminal justice, civil rights, human rights, economic despair, and it's really deepened our crisis, our collective pursuit of advancing law and justice. I do have some hope. I don't want to make this entirely about all that's negative. Just in my world in Connecticut, what I had seen, in the courthouses, and you start with that question. We went from 38 courthouses down to 6, open 3 days, 6 courthouses open 3 days a week. I've heard our chief court administrator quoting the chief court administrator in Michigan say, this is not the crisis that anyone wanted, but it's the crisis that we needed. Our court system has advanced in the last 10 weeks, and the bar has been a partner in this, in implementing technology that was 10 years overdue. And so what does that mean? If we start opening up the courts virtually and providing technology to more and more people, it just improves access to justice. It allows us to bring that access to justice gap down in ways that I don't think was foreseeable before the pandemic hit. The courts are working hard on trying to figure out ways to open up the court to provide access to justice, not just now, but long term, to more people, to reduce the costs of civil litigation, to provide speedier trials and speedier arraignments for those in the criminal courts. I think these are technological advances that are long overdue, that if we continue on this trajectory, is pretty exciting. And I think will positively influence the way we conduct our court system.
And I'd just like to remind the audience, you can send in questions. We're going to move to the question section now. On the GoToWebinar control panel, you should be able to chat them to Andrea, and then I'll turn to her in a few moments. Monte, thank you for mentioning the Stevenson lecture, I think it probably was, that brought Barney Frank to campus. The lecture series is still going strong. We had Heather McGee this year she was at Demos as the president, and has a book coming out in 2021 called This Is Us, which reflects on a lot of the issues that we've raised so far this evening. Kristen, I was wondering if I could ask you, was there anything at Choate that prepared you for what you're doing now, that inspired you maybe in the same way that Monte was, or whether there's anything that stands out as you carry out the work that you're doing?
I always love talking about one of my favorite teachers at Choate, the late Professor Goodyear, who was just great. I forget the formal name of his class, but it was just a great introduction into government and into social studies. And, one day he packed up our small class into a car, and we drove up to Hartford to watch a longstanding school desegregation case. And, I think that moment for me was when kind of the seeds were planted that eventually kind of, ripened into me becoming a civil rights lawyer, which is what I've been doing for the last 19 years. But I'd like to think that my interest in civil rights, frankly, was born through my experience at Choate, Mr. Goodyear's class, and just being in the nurturing environment of Wallingford, having access to great teachers and great friends, and yeah.
We still take the trip up to Hartford. It's a slightly larger class now, so we had a yellow school bus this past fall. They've actually restored commuter service from Wallingford to Hartford, and so we're hopeful that next fall, whatever that looks like, we're able to walk from campus down to the station and maybe take the train right there to Union Station, because the students have similar experiences to what you describe of seeing the government work, or at times seeing the government not work so well, and finding those equally inspirational. I just wanted to check with Andrea to see if there are any questions from the attendees this evening.
Jonas, there is one. It's not necessarily related to COVID, but it's about the police brutality that we're seeing with certain segments of the population in this country, and wanting to hear your views, Kristen and Monte, about what can we do about that on a local and national level, and that was one of the questions.
Yeah, it's incredibly sad, and I think that this has been an intense few days for many communities across the country. Many of us saw the video of a man in Minneapolis who virtually had his neck crushed, and who died in front of our very eyes, handcuffed, unarmed, nonviolent. There's Ahmaud Arbery, not killed by the police, but essentially killed by gun-wielding white men who claimed that they were carrying out a citizen's arrest, and who enjoyed protection of cover from prosecutors for weeks until the public started to express outrage. There's a horrible incident that played out in Central Park with a white woman who made a false claim that she was being attacked by a black man. What's interesting to me is that many of these incidents we're talking about because there just happened to be a video. And I think about all of the victims out there where there is no recording, there is no bystander, there is no video that just happened to be running that captured the incident. I think it is just a reminder that while there is this narrative that where we are post-racial, that it's incredibly false. That we've made a lot of progress as a nation, but that progress is fragile, and every day we see it kind of rolling back and rolling back. And I think that this is a moment where, even amid the pandemic, we need to have real robust conversation about where we are as a country when it comes to racism and racial bias, because these are very real issues and problems that are kind of tearing at the fabric of our nation. And there are many communities that feel vulnerable and exposed, and that they don't have people out there who can protect them, a justice system that will turn a blind eye or cover up the bias. A federal government that sadly is just not at work when it comes to confronting discrimination, and is sometimes fanning the flames of hatred. So we have a lot of work to do, and I just want to acknowledge that this is a really painful moment, particularly for communities of color all across the country.
Yeah, for sure. Well, let's end on an optimistic note. What is your most optimistic outlook on how we as a country can make the best of what's happening, since March, and how we move forward?
I mean, I'm happy to start. I'm hoping that through this crisis that people will come together. That, you know, people walking in their neighborhoods, having deep conversations with people, reconnecting with people, having discussion, and really reflecting about how we are really all of this together. I know it sounds trite, but if people take that to heart, I think we can come a long way. One of the things that's been a real pleasure to me is, you know, we're, you know, reconnecting with classmates and on a weekly basis having conversations on the phone for an hour in ways that are much different than, you know, the 30-second text conversations. And hoping that those deep conversations are happening throughout the country, people reflecting on really what's important and why. You know, we saw that after 9/11. It lasted for a period of time, and then we all went back to our lives. I'm hoping that this has a long-term impact and people really take stock in what is possible, and we put this country back on track for curing some of our ills.
Right.
So empathy, moments of empathy, I think have kept me very encouraged. I was reading a story about folks who work with the homeless in Philadelphia, and you know, working to distribute food to people who are hungry, and to people who are experiencing homelessness. And in the context of doing that work, they were sticking voter registration forms in the packets of food. And those moments of public empathy, I think, keep me very, very encouraged. And then there are the leadership moments too. And I want to just close by hearkening back to a great moment of leadership on the part of Choate during Hurricane Katrina, when the school took on a few students who were displaced by the hurricane. And I think those kinds of moments of leadership are, you know, the moments that we really need right now to get through this pandemic. So there's a lot of work to do, but I think we absolutely have to remain hopeful to get that work done.
Yeah, agreed. That's all I have for questions. Jonas, do you have any closing remarks, or are we good to go?
Thank you both for your time this evening. Thank you for your leadership on these issues. Obviously, they're not easy and continually evolving, and keep, as Kristen mentioned, keep some of us up at night. But we'll work through them and hope to come out of this as best as we possibly can, keeping in mind the idea of empathy and also maybe improving our connections in our communities and with those who maybe we haven't been so close to. So
yes, thank you.
Yeah,
thank you, Kristen and Monte. We know you're both really busy, and it's been wonderful for us to be with you this evening. And special thanks to you, Jonas, for facilitating a very informative, interesting, and critical conversation for us all to think about. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and please stay tuned for our next program in our ConnectsUs series. Stay healthy and take care of each other.